Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to WillCast. And Ken, welcome to WillCast. How's it going, Ken?
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate it. I think it's fair to say that you're somebody who is really conscious about time. So for you to take in your time out of your day to do this is very much appreciated.
My pleasure. I love talking about time and all those things.
I do too. Uh, But before we get into that, I would love if you could briefly introduce yourself to the listeners who might not know who you are. What kind of work do you do?
Okay, I'm a literary manager, producer, and I've been doing what I do now for the last 35, 40 years. Before that, I was a tenured professor of comparative literature. And so a lot of what I do has to do with reaching out and helping inspire people and uh, help them do what they're trying to do better and faster and more satisfactorily. And especially because I work with artists, uh, especially helping them understand the creative mind and what makes it tick and how to get around it and get it to do stuff you want it to do and avoid all the tricks the rest of the mind is trying to play on your creativity. So I'm always happy to speak about that to anybody who wants to listen.
It's amazing, and I have, especially the past few years, I have tried to really optimize my time because beforehand, I guess I always say I've lived two different lives, which is kind of funny because I'm only 24 years old, and it's like, how much experience can I really have? But I didn't really start managing my time properly until a few years ago. And I guess what I want to ask you right off the bat is what is kind of the first advice you would give to someone who wants to manage their time better?
Well, I think it to me it starts with the realization that there are two forces at play in your life. If you're happy doing what you do in a creative world, and those two forces are work and time, and you need to stop and think about uh, an issue about them, which is which one of them is finite. And most people make the wrong decision. They think that their their time is uh, infinite and that work is finite. And it's just the other way around. Work is infinite, and time is finite, unless you happen to be God or the creator of the universe. And then, even then, we don't know for sure, right? But uh, work is infinite, which means that you can't manage it. You can't manage an infinite force. You can only manage something that's finite. And it's infinite because if you do bad work, you have to do more work. If you do okay work, you still have to do more work.
Mm,
And if you do great work, you will do more work because everybody will be throwing work at you. So, given that work is infinite, you can get very depressed and very unsettled by trying to manage it. An example is to say, I'm going to go to the lake this summer and finish this book if it kills me. And what happens when you go to the lake is that 300 things suddenly appear that have to be done before you can settle down and work on the book. The cottage needs to be cleared of cobwebs, maybe repainted. The yard needs to be freed of weeds and the lawn cut. The dock needs to be scrubbed and cleaned. The list is endless, but everybody knows that setting out to do work no matter what is self-defeating. And that means that all you can do is to manage time. And the people who are wildly productive are people who work on a regular basis for a certain number of hours a day. Some people just work for an hour a day and accomplish their writing that way. That's 365 hours a year. And you could write several books with that much time. And people like Agatha Christie, she wrote 20 plus books a year to the point where she had to have a couple of pseudonyms to go out with because she just was writing so much. Why? Because she was simply sitting there and writing every day. Some people, like my late friend Nancy Friedman, who published about 20 novels in her lifetime, she spent 8 hours a day. Of course, she was flat on her back, paralyzed, and had to build a typewriter. I mean, a computer typewriter that she could reach up to. So it was quite
Oh
painful,
wow,
but she did it for 8 hours a day,
that's amazing.
um, because she loved working so much. But she limited it to 8 hours. She stopped after 8 hours. And some people stopped after, like I used a science fiction writer, well-known writer A.E. Van Vogt, who stopped after he wrote one paragraph. If he could write a good paragraph, that was it for the day, and he you took the rest of the day off to do the other billion things that life wants you to do other than write. So you have to, I think, learn from the beginning that the one force you can manage is time, and focus on managing time and stealing the time that you need to get the projects done that you want to get done.
Mm. You say you can't manage work necessarily, but how would you go about managing the type of work you do? Would that be managing time then?
Yeah, it's managing time. You decide that, I'm in a very busy world where I have to read every day, but I can't. If I read more than an hour a day, I wouldn't be able to manage all the other things I have to do.
Mm.
So I get up and early in the morning and have a cup of coffee and read for an hour and get the most important reading done every day, and then I go on to all the other things I do, including writing. Uh, so that's managing work.
Mm.
And I notice now that I'm particularly behind. I just got back from a 2 week trip to Japan, and I probably am five big manuscripts behind and hundreds of little pieces of paper behind. So I'm thinking, of maybe spending more time a day for the next couple of weeks to
Yeah.
catch up. I'll make that decision and then implement it. And when I was studying Greek in high school, I ran across an ancient saying from a book called The Works and Days by Hesiod, a Greek farmer from about 500 BC. And it says, if you put a little upon a little, soon it will become a lot.
Mm.
And the example he gave was a farmer who has to move a pile of dung from one part of his barnyard to another. And it's a back-breaking job because the pile is 6 feet high, and he would just break his back if he tried to do it all at once. But instead, he did it for half an hour every day, and within a few weeks, the whole pile was moved, and he didn't feel the strain. But he was meticulous about spending the half hour every day. And there's an example of time management applied to work.
Yeah.
You know,
I think
work.
that's also motivational wise, breaking things down in small steps instead of uh, doing one big thing at a time, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you have a huge task in front of you, like writing your PhD thesis, or writing a novel, or writing a screenplay, the first liberating notion that goes through your mind is, I don't have to do this all at once. What if I just did, you know, in increments? What if I did an hour a day? What if I did 2 hours a day? What if I did 10 pages at a time and then quit? And quitting is the hardest thing to learn, especially for the artistic personality, because artists like to be fully immersed in what they do and they don't like any rules. Um, but they have to impose discipline on themselves. I always urge people to get rid of the notion of the muse, because that makes you dependent on some kind of imaginary outside force. You need to be your own muse, and you need to take over the management of your work and time. And so that's the way you deal with something big, is breaking into things that are small. Nobody could sit down and write a novel. You sit down and write a page at a time,
Mm.
and before you know it, if you stick to that, if you're typing 10 pages a day, and that took you 2 hours, you'd have, how long would it take you to type 200 pages? The length of a novel, or twice the length of a screenplay. It wouldn't take you that long. It's
Yeah.
just the persistence that does it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good way to look at it. I feel like something that I've actually it's this is kind of a strange question. I feel like I've never met anybody who kind of feels the same way that I do, but perhaps you have, or maybe you have felt the same way. I have kind of anxiety for time. Like seriously. Um I think I'm super afraid that I will never be able to do everything that I want in life. And I think that might be typical for creative people.
I think it is typical for creative people. I mean, I still feel that way, and I'm a bit older than you are. But I don't take it as seriously as I used to. I know I can't do everything, which I didn't know until, you know, a few years ago. Uh, and I know some things are more worth doing than others.
Hmm.
And so I think that'll go away in time, but don't worry about it. It's actually a motivator. It just means that you're creative. The creative part of your brain wants you to be using it all the time as much as possible because it's got great stuff to offer the world and it doesn't want to go away without having fulfilled its promise to itself. And so I like the fact that you have that feeling because it's a positive sign about the prognosis of your creativity.
It definitely forces me to look at the way I spend time, for sure, without a doubt, and spend my time better and not wasting time. So in that sense, it's a blessing. But it's also frustrating.
Yeah, it's frustrating, but that's okay. You could live with frustration. I mean, if you're not frustrated, you're not doing anything important anyway.
Mm,
Frustration is the natural condition of the creative life.
it's a good point, and I guess to kind of build on that, feeling these negative emotions in a way. I've also always wondered if if what creates artists is trauma and pain, just kind of like comedians. I think comedians oftentimes will compensate something that has happened to them in their childhood and joke around and make fun. Do you think that's kind of the same way with artists? That artists have to experience some sort of trauma or pain for their art to be good?
There's a famous book called The Drama of the Gifted Child that basically says that art comes out of trauma, childhood trauma,
Can't or
and
can?
that it does,
Okay, okay.
that is the natural spring of art. I'm not sure I totally believe that. I can't disprove it, but there's something to it for sure. That something's got to be rattling around in your brain that makes you want to create something. And when you think about creation, is really order and chaos. It's making order out of chaos, and it operates on trivial levels. Like I always think it's funny that as the week goes by, my office floor is filled with paper. And the first thing I do on the weekend is I start picking the paper up and filing it. But I like the feeling of being, surrounded by all these projects and in partial garb, and just kind of in the middle of a mess because it's very satisfying to clean the mess up
Mm.
and to put order to it. And that's what happens when you're working on a novel or a screenplay or a symphony is you got all this stuff floating through your head and your your task is to stand there with a baton and bring order to it, and that's a natural feeling. So to the extent that your childhood was chaotic and things were out of your control, I can see that as a real motivator to seek the control that artistic expression brings you. It's a way of bringing order to your life, which is control. And when you think about the whole universe out there, it's a great big challenge that people try to control. And you're not sure whether it cares about control or not. You wonder, when asteroids hit the moon and all kinds of stuff is seems to be random. But all the more reason that humans like to bring control to their lives. And when you think about it, if you create a great play or a great, novel, you've made a statement kind of against the chaos of the universe. You've put it all together into something that makes sense. And one of our great drives as humans is the belief that things make sense and the attempt to prove it. Um, that becomes truer and truer every day as our world becomes more and more chaotic. I think it will lead to great masterpieces if we survive the present,
Mm,
the present chaos.
yeah, I've always found that so interesting, and I've heard musicians purposely try to stay in painful situations because it just enhances their art. It,
Yeah, I think it's in my first book about writing and creativity, A Writer's Time. I talk about the fact that the more you understand your process, the less you need pain and suffering. And I kind of divide productive writers into two groups, happy ones and unhappy ones. And when I start studying those two groups, I see that the unhappy ones are almost to a person ones that did not ever, never did understood their process. So they often end in tragedy, like Hemingway or Sylvia Plath or Virginia Woolf, you know, artists who commit suicide. Sometimes they just do it, like Janis Joplin, with drugs. And, there's myriad examples. But when people start understanding their process, they don't need to inflict pain on themselves as much. And there is a process to creativity that is a natural process. It's followed by all creative people, whether they're aware of it or not. And once I learned that, I started understanding that I'm not sure suffering really is the generator of creativity. I think that it's a natural part of the brain. The brain's divided into these, the dominating part of what I call the accountant or the continent of reason that wants everything to be orderly, all the trains running on time, uh, nobody shows up late. We're always watching the clock. And the reason we do that is that it generates money, and money generates life and keeps people fed and all of that. So that's the main part of the brain. Then there's part of your brain that is what I call the visionary islands, and they are the parts of your brain that seem to be just floating around this continent of reason and have crazy ideas, don't understand the clock, don't feel the need to be on the same timetable as anybody else. For example, if you have been in a situation where you see a friend that you haven't seen for 10 years, and within 30 seconds of seeing them, you're back on the same exact wavelength that you were on the last time you were there, you see that there's been a jump in time, or that time has actually stood still. The time,
mm,
the island of time in which your friendship existed
yeah.
is still exactly the way it was 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And that's because it's truly a visionary part of your life. And, uh, and then the third part of your mind is what I call the managing editor. It's the awareness factor. It's the part of your mind that is aware these other two exist and realizes that they're in a combat, kind of a lethal combat, and try to intervene between them to make them work together, and makes bargains with them. So it says to the continent, just let me work 1 hour a day on my book, and I'll be your slave the rest of the day, and go to the post office and do the work I'm supposed to do and all of that. And it makes a bargain because if it makes that bargain, then the continent will shut up for an hour instead of trying to interrupt the writing, and that process is goes on. And the more you're aware of the process, the happier you are because you realize you can control it by being aware, and whether you're talking about a spiritual quest like Eckhart Tolle, who's talking about awareness being the step between the ego and sheer being. That's kind of what's happening in the creative mind too, is the managing editor is trying to intervene to allow the islands to express themselves. That means the continent's got to shut up its nagging and shut up its argumentation that this isn't going to lead anywhere. You're not going to make any money from it. Why are you doing it? Why don't you go back to the post office and work hard and get a bigger paycheck? And you got to shut that voice up, or you'll never get anything done as a creator.
Mm. So do you think everyone is born creative and people who don't go creative ways have a hard time shutting that voice up?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, I think there's inklings of creativity in everybody. There's what I call the artistic syndrome, where people talk about being artists and are constantly doing things that artists do, but never do produce anything. And that's because their continent is shutting them up. They're just strangling the islands of creativity
Mm. That's super
because
interesting. Sorry?
and the continent is based on its motivating factor is survival and fear, and that's what it's based on. And fear is, huge motivator, and so you've got to overcome that fear if you're going to actually do something creative. You have to turn your back on it, and that's what the managing editor allows you to do: turn your back on the reasonable part of your mind and buy as much time away from it as you can.
That's super interesting. I love that thought. What do you think made you creative and made you go the creative path?
Well, I'm kind of a maverick because I'm both creative and I'm very strong, accounting skills because my father was an accountant,
Mm.
and so I think that I'm lucky in that way. Um, I never went completely creative. Um, I write and I've written, I think, published 30 books of my own, something like that.
That's amazing.
And I've probably written 14 screenplays or more. And but I also am a literary manager, a producer. I was a professor before because my continent, my accountant just never let me go completely.
Mm.
And I enjoy both sides of it all. I wouldn't like to just be um, creating, all the time because one thing I don't like about the creative world is how little control creators have over their destinies until they become successful. And when they become successful, things change, but often they change so late in their career that the change can destroy them. Um, you can see that everywhere. The Elvis Presley movie recently, that he was never quite in control, especially when Colonel Parker came along um, to take control. He kind of relinquished it to him gladly because he wasn't really interested in control. He was interested in singing. And this allowed him just to sing.
Mm.
But unfortunately, it also took advantage of him because, he needed to be more in control than he was. And uh, so it's a very interesting study to see how that interaction occurs.
Do you think as an artist to become successful, you will need that accountant side as well?
I think the more well developed it is in you, the more likely you'll have take control of your career. Um, and it's a it's a fine line because if it becomes too well developed, then it'll find something else for you to do than compose music or paint whatever you're doing. So it's a fine line. It's a balance that's required. And the balance, of course, comes from awareness of what's going on
Hmm.
inside your mind. I think the first chapter of A Writer's Time is, the creative mind, what's going on in there. Um, and I draw a map of it and walk people through, how you recognize what's really happening inside your head and how to start taking control of it.
Fascinating. I guess my next question kind of goes hand in hand because, as an artist, as we just talked about, to become successful, you will need to know how to sell your art, right? So, one of my struggles has always been how much art do I create for myself versus how much do I create for an audience or a market?
Well, that's a really interesting question because it pushes one of the buttons that make me crazy. Um, I don't think artists I don't think artists are really artists if they just do it for themselves. I think
Okay.
artists communicate. I think that they are at their essence they are communicators. Communicators means there's an audience. So I mean, I was in one of the things I wrote lately. I think can you imagine telling a joke on an empty porch? you know
Mm-hmm.
that's so silly,
Yeah.
it's so kind of stupid to think about, right? And that's what it's like to create art for yourself. Like, oh, I don't want anybody to see it, I just want to do it. I don't get it. I don't think that's the way we're structured. I don't think that the people who did the cave paintings were doing it only for themselves. I think they were strutting, they were doing them so other people would look at them and go, oh my god, isn't that cool? Or doesn't that, won't that give us power? Or whatever art does, of which there are great things it does in human life. It's a social thing. So ask your question again with that in mind, and let's see if I can answer it better.
But that's super interesting actually because I would have thought it was the exact opposite, that the best art would come from somebody who creates art for themselves, somebody who creates the art that they like. Do you know what I mean?
No, actually, the very sentence that you use um, contradicts itself, because you say the best art comes from this kind of person. But where are you getting the word the best art?
Subjective.
Well, okay, but that just means your mud pie is bigger than my mud pie. I mean, what the very idea of the best art comes from judgment, and judgment comes from something external to the artist.
Hmm.
So would you then also argue that anything that a person calls art is art, and therefore also the best art?
I would not argue that it's the best, but I would argue that it is still art.
That it is still art?
Yeah.
But art has always been judged art by society. There's an incredible line from my favorite book on art. It's called Picasso by Gertrude Stein. The great American novelist who lived in Paris and one of his best friends. And she said, what Pablo was doing was painting what only he was seeing. He was seeing, and he was painting what he was seeing. And after a while, we were seeing what he was painting. And then, of course, he was not seeing it anymore.
But was he creating with an audience in mind then?
Uh, yeah, he
Okay.
was. He was creating to be judged and to dazzle an audience and to be judged by the audience. Because when you see surrounding him were others who were painting in similar veins and similar ways, most of them have been forgotten, but a few of them, including him, were remembered. And there's all kinds of famous stories about him scribbling on a napkin, and the napkin later selling for $500,000, um, because he created an art form that people recognized as different and new and moving and inspiring, whereas others who were scribbling the same strange shapes never got that to that level of acceptance. So when you're accepted by a society as art, that's the highest form of art um, by historical definition.
Hmm.
You have to be kind of told that things are art in order to for them to be art. Because I remember when I was a professor, I gave a class about art, and I would start out with 8 or 9 slides randomly put together from ancient Babylonian statuettes to electrical circuits to modern art of various kinds. So that, and then I would just flash them to a completely uneducated class that had not done any studies in art and ask them to comment on each one and how important a piece of art it was. And it's funny, they couldn't sort it out until they were told that this was this was art. This was not art. They just thought, if everything is art, I got to figure out why is it art? And it's the minute that they hear that something is art, then they can't ever undo that image in their head and have to see it as art again. And the minute they are told that something is not art, then they can't see it as art again. And what that tells me is that the brain isn't working alone when it comes to art. It's working in a huge canvas, a huge context that has other brains behind it over hundreds of years. I mean, how can you write like a truly original breakthrough novel, for example, if you haven't read, Cervantes and Tristram Shandy and Moby Dick and James Joyce and you know you can write what you write. I used to have undergraduates who did this all the time. They refused to read the past because they said they were brilliant and blah blah blah. But all the stuff they were writing down was, to someone who knew literature, was almost silly because it was it was kind of fractured echoes of stuff that had been done long ago by somebody.
Hmm.
So there is a context. Art is, exists in a context, and even in AI, when you ask a computer to write a poem, it takes the poem from programming that it's been assimilating, and it puts together programming and trying to do it in original ways. But if a computer had never been programmed with phrases and
Hmm.
gerunds and infinitives and stuff, it wouldn't know what to do. The programming is what tells it what to do, you know?
I I get what you're saying. I'm just still not sure about your point on it has somebody else has to tell you that it's art. So say for example someone who likes to paint in their living room by themselves and they have no intentions of showing the world. They just do it for themselves because they enjoy it. Is that not art because it's not being shown to anybody?
Yes, I think by definition, it's not art, it's therapy.
Okay.
Just as I think as somebody writing a journal, in a journal workshop that's not art either. That's therapy. There's nothing wrong with it, and it might make you feel better, but it's only art if it follows rules. Like Robert Frost said once that writing free verse is like playing tennis with the nets down, which I thought was great
Mm.
because you if you play tennis as I do, you'd have to be an awfully good player to play without the nets,
Yeah.
you know. And what he's telling you is that when it comes to writing authentic free verse, you have to know what you're doing. You have to know what metrical verse is in order to write free verse. If you're just doing it randomly without any knowledge of that tradition or the other tradition, then it's just what is it? It's to be crass, it's a form of masturbation. To be psychological, it's a form of therapy, but it's not art. Art is something that's recognized and established. This is just my working
Mm-hmm.
view of it. It's good to have this conversation, but it leaves me cold when I hear somebody, "Oh, you've got to write his journals. They're so interesting." But I mean, if you lived a long life and read lots of journals, to say this is interesting, it better be really interesting because
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing I can imagine someone writing that I haven't read before. And if I start reading, one of my great thrills to this day is sitting down in the morning and reading something that I know is great and that I know I can't wait to get it out there and make it into a movie or a book
Mm-hmm.
because that writer has a consciousness of the genre within which she's writing, and she has mastered it. And it's not because if somebody who sends you a manuscript filled with all small letters, no capital letters, uh, I just like ugh, it makes me sick because somebody's already done that and turned it into a lifelong career. And for somebody to discover it and think that she's the first one doing it just means there's something sad about it because it means they have no consciousness of the rest of human life and experience, and they don't care. Now, that's fine. I'm not a therapist. I'm what I am, a literary manager and so on, a literary person. So a therapist could think that's wonderful, and that's fine with me. A mother could think it's wonderful. That's fine if the mother thinks it's wonderful. But for somebody to send it to me and tell me they want me to sell it for $1 million, I mean, I would just be, I don't have a buyer I could send it to who wouldn't just call me up to ask me if I'd lost my mind. You know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean?
Yeah.
So that tells me that there is a socialness about it that within which you work. And it doesn't have to be art. It can just be good commercial stuff. It's still, you can't write an action thriller without being aware of the previous action thrillers that have been written. And the best new action thrillers always have nods to the earlier ones
Mm.
to show that they're aware of the tradition in which they're writing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that tells me that um, when you get to the level beyond the therapy, maybe a painter does start off in the living room just painting colors that are pretty, but if somebody walks into the living room and goes, "Oh my God, that is stunning," it changes everything. Just that comment changes the nature of the activity. I mean, what if I could impress other people with this? And that's the kind of birth of art. It's what turns it into you know, the art that people stop and look at.
Yeah. And I completely agree that not necessarily that I think art should be is all meant to be seen by people, but it does feel, at least for me, better to create something that will create some sort of reaction.
Yeah.
Um, I guess my final question is this is something I really want to know is I believe I heard you say at some point in an interview that the Meg took 22 years to get made.
Yeah.
What does that process look like?
Well, it looks very painful and very agonizing and, you know, frustrating. Uh, it teaches you everything you need to know about being in the business, which is patience, patience, patience. And I used to say that patience was my first name, but now I would say it's my middle name, my last name, and my first name. Uh, because I've had other movies that have taken 16 years and 12 years and so
Wow.
on, and one that took 3 months. So, you know, but the Meg is won all the awards. Gandhi took, I think, 10 years or 20 years. So what it looks like is we sold it for a lot of money to Disney. They sat on it for 3 years. They tried to develop it, but commercial competition made them take it off the shelf in a very interesting way. The agent who sold it for us was a guy named Jeff Robinoff, and Jeff sold it to an arch rival of his, a guy he really did not like, who was the head of Disney.
Hmm.
But he sold it to him, and that guy determined to get it made, and started in good faith with us into getting it made. And then suddenly, out of the blue, Jeff got an offer from to be the head of Warner Brothers. He was a big shot agent at ICM, and suddenly he was now the head of production at Warner Brothers. And the first thing he did is he looked on Warner's shelves and pulled a shark movie off the shelf, Deep Blue Sea, and green lighted it and put, a rocket under it to get it done before Disney could release Meg. So the minute that happened, Disney dropped Meg,
Oh.
and we went through a 3 year period of, moaning and bemoaning, etc. And then I resold it to New Line, who had it for about 3 years, and were within a week of green lighting it when they suddenly have jitters about the budget and didn't believe the director, could bring it in for the budget that was authorized, and they dropped it too. And then more years went by before the new producers came on and sold it to Warner, which by then had acquired New Line. And so some of the people involved in the original Meg deal ended up being involved in the final movie.
Mm.
So these are, I could tell you 10 sagas like this about projects that have gone into what we call limbo. And Meg was lucky to rise out of limbo into, let's not call it heaven, but whatever the next, metaphor is.
But what is the logic for dropping it from Disney instead of just holding it and maybe see in the future if it's possible for them to create?
Well, because there was pressure from us on that. We didn't want it
Ah,
sitting
okay.
around
Yeah,
forever.
I see.
Like we have another several projects. One of them is one of the greatest screenplays I've ever read or sold, called Henry's List of Wrongs. And that was sold for a lot of money at auction. New Line had it for several years and never got it made. So it went into turnaround, what's called turnaround. And maybe 8 years later, I sold it to Universal. And Universal realized that the problem with it is that it was romantic comedy with a male lead, that it needed a female lead. So they hired a writer who turned it into Cindy's List of Wrongs instead of Henry's List of Wrongs. And they couldn't get that made either, because for it to get made, they would have had to pay $10 million to the studio that owned it before to get it out of turnaround. And anyway,
Hmm.
it's languishing in limbo still.
Ah, I
And
see.
this happens a lot in Hollywood, is that the greatest stories never get made because of complicated, extremely complicated politics, money issues, personality issues, so on.
Ken, thank you so much for taking your time to do this. This was a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Patrick. It was nice to talk to you. And it's always educational. You start learning when you start saying things, it sounds like you really believe them. And then you get to test them by having a bright interlocutor like
Mm-hmm.
yourself to get into it with. And I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Where can people find you and your work?
Well, my best place to do is go to storymerchant.com, and you'll see my books listed there and movies and all of that. Story Merchant is kind of the main company of the four companies that I have. And that's the place to start, just storymerchant.com. And always look forward to talking to people.
Amazing. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Patrick. Take care.
And to the listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. As always, I appreciate it. Take it easy. Peace.